High in the Andes Mountains, where the air itself seems thin and precious, there exists a place that challenges everything we thought we knew about human civilization. At 12,000 feet above sea level, near the shores of Lake Titicaca, an empire once flourished where most societies would struggle merely to survive. This was Tiwanaku, a name that echoes across centuries with the weight of forgotten grandeur. Between 600 and 800 of the Common Era, Tiwanaku reached its magnificent peak. The city sprawled across 6 square kilometers of ceremonial splendor, crowned by monuments so precisely constructed that modern engineers still marvel at their engineering. The Akapana pyramid rose from the landscape like a statement of ambition. The Kalasasaya temple complex stood as proof that human ingenuity knows no geographical limits. These were not simple structures built by accident or impulse. They represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, refined agricultural techniques, and a civilization that had learned to transform hostile terrain into abundance. The people of Tiwanaku had mastered what seemed impossible. They developed raised field agriculture that turned marshland into productive farmland. Their trade networks stretched across vast distances, connecting distant cultures through exchange and influence. By 400 of the Common Era, they had already become the dominant force in the Titicaca Basin, surpassing all rivals in power and prestige. Yet within roughly 400 years of their peak, Tiwanaku vanished. Not through conquest or catastrophic warfare, but through something far more mysterious. The stones remained. The questions multiplied. High in the Andes Mountains, where the air itself seems thin and precious, there exists a place that challenges everything we thought we knew about human civilization. At 12,000 feet above sea level, near the southern shores of Lake Titicaca, an ancient people built something remarkable. They constructed not merely a settlement, but a vision of order imposed upon one of Earth's most unforgiving landscapes. This is the story of Tiwanaku, an empire that rose to breathtaking heights of achievement before vanishing into the mists of history, leaving behind monuments that still whisper secrets to those patient enough to listen. To understand Tiwanaku, we must first understand the land itself. The Bolivian Altiplano stretches across the high plateau of South America, a realm of extremes that tests human resilience at every turn. At 3,850 meters above sea level, the air contains barely half the oxygen available at sea level. Temperatures plunge dramatically each night, dropping from mild days to freezing evenings. Frost is common. Rainfall comes seasonally, concentrated in specific months, leaving long periods of dryness. The terrain itself is steep and forbidding, with limited areas suitable for traditional agriculture. Yet here, in this harsh environment, a civilization would flourish for centuries, eventually commanding influence across vast stretches of the Andes. The story begins not with conquest or violence, but with observation. Somewhere between 300 and 400 CE, as the Roman Empire crumbled in distant Europe, the people of the Titicaca Basin were learning to read their landscape. They noticed the seasonal patterns of water. They studied how the land rose and fell. They watched how certain areas remained more productive than others. Most importantly, they discovered something revolutionary. They could engineer the land itself. By 400 CE, Tiwanaku had become the largest and most important site in the Titicaca Basin, surpassing earlier centers like Pucara. This ascendancy was not accidental. It was built upon innovation. The civilization developed what scholars call raised field agriculture, a system of extraordinary sophistication that would reshape how humans could survive in this hostile terrain. These fields were not simple mounds of earth. They were carefully engineered platforms, elevated above the surrounding ground, with canals running between them. During the wet season, water filled these canals, creating an ingenious system that regulated moisture, prevented flooding, and captured heat that warmed the crops above. The thermal mass of the water protected plants from frost, a critical advantage in an environment where a single unexpected freeze could destroy an entire harvest. Archaeological research, particularly the work of scholars like Alan Kalata from the University of Chicago in the 1980s and 90s, revealed the sophistication of these systems. The raised fields were not scattered randomly, but arranged in patterns that suggest careful planning and community coordination. Some fields stretched for kilometers, indicating centralized management and the ability to mobilize large labor forces. This was agriculture transformed into engineering, necessity transformed into art. The productivity of raised field systems was remarkable. They could yield far more food per unit of land than traditional agriculture in such an environment. This surplus was crucial. It freed people from the constant struggle for subsistence. It allowed for specialization. Some could become artisans, others priests, others administrators. The surplus also allowed for something else: the accumulation of wealth and power. Those who controlled the most productive land and the labor to maintain these systems became elite. From this agricultural foundation, civilization began to rise. By 600 CE, Tiwanaku entered what scholars recognize as its peak period. This era, lasting until approximately 800 CE, saw the construction of the city's most impressive monuments. The semi-subterranean court, begun perhaps 2 centuries earlier around 300 to 400 CE, was expanded and refined. This was a ceremonial space, a rectangular sunken court where rituals unfolded before gathered crowds. The walls were lined with carved stone heads, perhaps representing ancestors or deities, their stylized faces gazing eternally outward. These sculptures suggest a people deeply concerned with the spiritual realm, with maintaining connection to forces beyond the visible world. More dramatically, the Akapana pyramid rose during this peak period. This was no small structure. The pyramid stood as a massive earthen mound, dominating the landscape, visible from great distances across the Altiplano. At its summit, elaborate stonework and ceremonial structures crowned the monument. The sheer effort required to construct such a building, moving countless tons of earth and stone by hand, speaks to the organizational power of Tiwanaku's elite and the willingness of the population to invest labor in religious and civic projects. The Kalasasaya temple complex, another major undertaking of this period, further demonstrated Tiwanaku's architectural ambitions. This was a monumental courtyard surrounded by precisely fitted stone walls, arranged in a rectangular configuration. Within this sacred space stood the Gateway of the Sun, perhaps the most iconic artifact of Tiwanaku civilization. This monolithic andesite portal, carved from a single block of stone, measured approximately 3 meters in height. Its surface was intricately decorated with geometric patterns and representations of a principal deity, a figure holding staffs, surrounded by smaller attendant figures arranged in rows. The gateway was not merely decorative, it was a statement of religious authority, a physical manifestation of the civilization's spiritual worldview. The precision of Tiwanaku's stonework was extraordinary. Stones were cut so accurately that they fit together without mortar, joints so tight that a knife blade could not pass between them. This was not crude construction, but masterwork, executed by craftspeople who understood geometry, who possessed tools of sufficient quality to shape hard stone, and who had the time and resources to pursue perfection. Every element suggested a culture that valued order, precision, and monumental expression of power. Yet monuments alone do not explain Tiwanaku's rise. The civilization's influence extended far beyond the immediate environs of the capital city. Trade networks connected Tiwanaku to distant regions. Evidence of Tiwanaku artifacts appears in archaeological sites across the Andes, from the coast to the jungle, from regions hundreds of kilometers away. This dispersal of artifacts suggests not merely trade, but cultural influence. Tiwanaku's distinctive artistic styles, particularly in ceramics, spread throughout the region. The civilization's religious iconography appeared on pottery and textiles produced in distant communities. This was cultural hegemony, the dominance of one civilization's ideas and aesthetics across a vast geographical area. Tiwanaku ceramics of this period were distinctive and beautiful. Polychrome pottery, decorated with multiple colors, depicted mythical beings, geometric patterns, and ritual scenes. Elite vessels called keros, beaker-shaped drinking cups, were crafted with extraordinary care. These were not utilitarian objects, but prestige items, used in ritual contexts and particularly in feasting ceremonies. The ability to produce such fine ceramics and to distribute them across vast distances further demonstrated Tiwanaku's organizational capacity and cultural prestige. The religious system that emerged at Tiwanaku appears to have centered on water, fertility, and celestial observation. Lake Titicaca itself held sacred significance. Islands within the lake, particularly the Island of the Sun, became pilgrimage destinations. Evidence of ritual offerings, including gold medallions and carved stones recovered from the lake's waters, indicates that Tiwanaku's people conducted ceremonies at these sacred sites. Pilgrims traveled from distant locations to participate in these rituals, further spreading Tiwanaku's cultural influence. The architectural orientation of Tiwanaku's monuments suggests astronomical awareness. The structures align with celestial events, particularly the winter and summer solstices. This was not coincidental, but deliberate, indicating that Tiwanaku's priests possessed knowledge of astronomy and incorporated this knowledge into their religious and ceremonial calendar. The ability to predict celestial events and to align monumental construction with these events further enhanced the prestige and authority of the priestly class. By the peak period of 600 to 800 CE, Tiwanaku had achieved something remarkable. The site covered over 400 hectares, with a ceremonial core of approximately 6 square kilometers. The population numbered in the tens of thousands. The city hummed with activity, craftspeople producing ceramics and textiles, traders arriving with goods from distant lands, priests performing rituals in monumental temples, administrators organizing labor and resources. The raised fields surrounding the city produced abundant harvests. The lakes teemed with fish. The mountains provided stone for construction and minerals for tools and ornaments. This was a civilization at its zenith. The environmental conditions were favorable. The agricultural systems were productive. The social organization was stable and hierarchical, with clear distinctions between elite and commoner, between religious and secular authority, though the line between these categories was often blurred. The religious ideology was compelling, offering explanations for natural phenomena and providing frameworks for understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. The artistic and architectural achievements were impressive, creating monuments that inspired awe and demonstrated the power of the state. Yet even in this moment of achievement, forces were beginning to stir that would eventually transform Tiwanaku's world. Climate patterns were shifting, though this change was gradual, almost imperceptible to those living through it. The delicate balance that had allowed civilization to flourish in this harsh environment was beginning to tip. The raised field systems, so productive in normal times, required constant maintenance. The canals needed regular cleaning. The fields themselves needed periodic repair. This maintenance required labor, organization, and resources. As long as the harvests remained abundant, as long as the elite could redistribute surplus to reward those who performed this labor, the system functioned. But if conditions changed, if the climate became less predictable, if harvests declined, the entire edifice could become unstable. Population growth also presented challenges. As Tiwanaku's population expanded, the demand for food increased. The raised fields could produce more than traditional agriculture, but their productivity was not infinite. There were limits to how much food could be extracted from the available land. As population pressed against these limits, competition for resources could emerge. The delicate social contract that held the civilization together could fray. The civilization that had risen to prominence through agricultural innovation and monumental construction was entering a new phase. The conditions that had allowed Tiwanaku to flourish were beginning to change. The peak period of 600 to 800 CE would give way to a different era. The monuments would continue to be constructed. The ceremonies would continue to be performed. The trade networks would continue to function. But the trajectory was shifting. The expansion that had characterized Tiwanaku's rise was reaching its limits. The forces that would eventually lead to transformation and decline were already in motion, though this truth would not become apparent for many generations. In this moment, though, at the height of Tiwanaku's achievement, none of this was apparent. The civilization stood at the summit of its power. The temples gleamed with fresh stonework. The gateway of the sun dominated the sacred precinct. The raised fields stretched across the landscape, producing abundant harvests. The trade networks brought exotic goods and foreign ideas to the city's markets. The priests performed rituals that seemed to maintain cosmic order. The elite commanded respect and resources. The common people labored, paid taxes, and participated in the grand civic projects that defined their civilization. This was Tiwanaku at its origins as a great power, having risen from humble beginnings to command influence across much of the Andes. The people who built this civilization possessed intelligence, creativity, and determination. They read their environment carefully and adapted to its demands. They organized themselves into complex hierarchies and created institutions capable of directing vast labor forces toward monumental ends. They developed technologies that allowed them to thrive in an environment that would have defeated less innovative peoples. They created art and architecture of genuine beauty and power. They built trade networks that connected them to distant peoples. They developed religious systems that provided meaning and purpose. Yet in the very achievements that defined Tiwanaku's greatness lay the seeds of future challenges. The monuments required constant maintenance. The agricultural systems demanded careful management. The trade networks depended on political stability. The religious ideology required regular ritual performance and successful predictions. The elite required constant demonstration of their power and authority. The common people required regular distribution of resources and the promise that their labor would be rewarded. All of these elements had to remain in balance for the civilization to endure. Tiwanaku had solved the problem of how to build civilization in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The civilization had achieved remarkable heights of achievement in art, architecture, agriculture, and organization. But the civilization had not yet faced the ultimate test: how to adapt when the conditions that had enabled its rise fundamentally changed. That test was coming. though the people of Tiwanaku could not yet perceive it. For now, the civilization stood at the apex of its power, a testament to human ingenuity and determination, a beacon of order and achievement in the high Andes. The story of Tiwanaku's ascendancy is not one of sudden conquest or dramatic emergence. Rather, it is a tale of gradual mastery, a civilization learning to bend the harsh Andean landscape to its will through ingenuity, organization, and an almost mystical understanding of the environment's rhythms. By 400 of the Common Era, Tiwanaku had become the largest and most important site in the Titicaca Basin, surpassing earlier ceremonial centers like Pucara. This transition marked the beginning of an era that would see the city grow into something unprecedented in the high Andes, a true urban center with regional influence, monumental architecture, and the capacity to sustain thousands of people at an elevation where the air itself seemed to resist human habitation. The foundation of this rise lay not in military conquest, but in agriculture. The Altiplano, that vast high plateau surrounding Lake Titicaca, presented challenges that would have seemed insurmountable to less resourceful peoples. At 3,850 meters above sea level, the climate is relentlessly harsh. Frosts strike frequently, even in summer months. Rainfall is seasonal and unpredictable. The soil, though rich in some places, is often poor and difficult to work. The growing season is brutally short. Yet the people of Tiwanaku developed a solution so elegant and effective that it would sustain their civilization for centuries: the raised field system, known locally as waru waru. These were not simple mounds of earth. They were sophisticated agricultural installations, carefully engineered through generations of experimentation and refinement. Imagine the landscape transformed into a patchwork of elevated planting beds, separated by canals of water. The beds themselves were constructed from layers of soil, organic material, and stone, built up to heights of 1 to 2 meters. Between them ran channels that could be filled with water from nearby springs or collected rainfall. This design served multiple purposes simultaneously, each one critical to survival in such a demanding environment. The water in the channels acted as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it slowly at night. This moderated the extreme temperature fluctuations that characterized the Altiplano, protecting crops from the devastating frosts that could destroy an entire harvest in a single night. The canals also provided irrigation during the dry season, ensuring that plants received moisture even when rain failed to fall. Additionally, the channels supported fish and aquatic plants, providing supplementary protein and nutrients that enriched the soil through natural cycles. The system was, in essence, a closed-loop agriculture that worked in concert with natural processes rather than against them. Archaeological research, particularly the work conducted by scholars like Alan Colata from the University of Chicago during the 1980s and 90s, revealed the true productivity of these raised fields. When reconstructed and studied in experimental settings, waru-waru systems demonstrated the capacity to produce yields 3 to 4 times greater than conventional agriculture on the same terrain. Some estimates suggest that at their peak, these systems could support populations of extraordinary density for the high Andes. This agricultural revolution was not merely a technological innovation. It was the engine that powered Tiwanaku's rise to prominence. As agricultural surplus accumulated, so too did the resources available for the construction of monumental architecture. Between 300 and 400 of the Common Era, Tiwanaku's elite directed the construction of the semi-subterranean court, a ceremonial space that announced the city's growing ambitions. This sunken plaza, accessed by descending a ceremonial stairway, was surrounded by walls into which were carved stone heads of captives or supernatural beings. The psychological effect was deliberate and powerful. Those who entered this sacred space descended into another realm, one controlled and defined by Tiwanaku's elite and their religious authorities. But it was during the period from 600 to 800 of the Common Era that Tiwanaku reached its zenith of architectural ambition and cultural influence. This was the era when the city's population swelled to perhaps 40,000 souls, making it one of the largest settlements in the pre-Columbian Americas. The core ceremonial area expanded to cover approximately 6 square kilometers, while the broader urban zone stretched across more than 400 hectares. The landscape itself was remade in the image of Tiwanaku's cosmology. The Kalasasaya temple complex rose during this period, a massive rectangular enclosure constructed from precisely fitted stone blocks. At its center stood the Gateway of the Sun, a monolithic portal carved from a single block of andesite. This gateway, roughly 10 feet in height, was decorated with intricate iconography depicting the principal deity of Tiwanaku's pantheon. The carving style was distinctive and immediately recognizable, featuring the characteristic frontal-facing figure with radiating lines suggesting divine power and cosmic connection. This was not merely a decorative element, it was a theological statement, a permanent proclamation of the spiritual authority that underwrote Tiwanaku's political power. The Akapana pyramid, perhaps the most impressive structure at the site, dominated the urban landscape. This stepped pyramid rose in tiers, creating a dramatic silhouette visible across the surrounding plain. Its construction required the movement of hundreds of thousands of tons of stone, organized labor on a scale that demanded sophisticated administrative systems, and an engineering knowledge that allowed builders to construct stable structures in an environment where freeze-thaw cycles could destabilize ordinary masonry. The Akapana was not merely a monument to human ambition. It was a functional sacred space, with internal passages and chambers that served ritual purposes still not entirely understood by modern scholars. Scattered throughout the site stood monolithic statues, some reaching heights of 20 feet or more. The Bennett monolith and the Ponce monolith were among the most impressive, depicting elite figures holding elaborate ceremonial vessels called keros. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. These figures possessed an almost hypnotic quality, their faces stylized but somehow conveying authority and spiritual presence. They were carved from single blocks of stone using tools that were themselves stone or bronze. The precision of the work suggests not merely technical skill, but obsessive attention to detail, a willingness to invest enormous labor in achieving a specific aesthetic and spiritual effect. The ceramics produced at Tiwanaku during this era were equally distinctive. Polychrome pottery, decorated with images of mythical beings and geometric patterns, emerged as a marker of elite status and religious authority. These vessels were not merely functional containers, they were theological objects, their decoration conveying cosmological knowledge and spiritual power. When such vessels were discovered in archaeological contexts, they often appeared alongside evidence of feasting and ritual consumption, suggesting that the act of drinking from these decorated vessels was itself a sacred practice that reinforced social hierarchies and spiritual bonds. Tiwanaku's influence extended far beyond its immediate hinterland. Through trade networks that stretched across the Andes and into the Amazon lowlands, Tiwanaku goods and ideas traveled to distant regions. Obsidian from the highlands, turquoise from distant sources, shells from the Pacific coast, and exotic feathers from Amazonian birds all found their way to Tiwanaku's elite. In return, Tiwanaku's distinctive artistic style, the iconography of the Gateway of the Sun, the characteristic ceramic designs, the architectural conventions, appeared in settlements and ceremonial sites hundreds of kilometers away. This was not necessarily an empire in the conventional sense. Scholars debate the nature of Tiwanaku's political organization and the extent of its direct control over distant regions. Some argue that Tiwanaku exerted a loose cultural hegemony, a religious and artistic influence that other communities voluntarily adopted or adapted. Others suggest a more formal political structure, with tributary relationships and administrative hierarchies. The evidence remains ambiguous, preserved in pottery styles and architectural conventions rather than in written records. What seems clear is that Tiwanaku's influence was profound and far-reaching, extending across a region of tens of thousands of square kilometers. Lake Titicaca itself became a sacred landscape within Tiwanaku's cosmological vision. The Island of the Sun and the Island of the Moon were transformed into pilgrimage destinations, sacred places where devotees traveled to make offerings and commune with the divine. Archaeological investigations of these islands have revealed elaborate stone constructions, terraced agricultural systems, and evidence of ritual activities spanning centuries. In the lake's waters themselves, underwater archaeologists have discovered gold medallions and intricately carved stones, objects that appear to have been deliberately deposited as offerings to the deity associated with the lake. These underwater discoveries suggest a landscape understood as sacred, where the boundary between the terrestrial and aquatic realms was permeable and subject to ritual manipulation. The organization required to sustain such a civilization was itself a remarkable achievement. Tiwanaku's elite developed administrative systems capable of organizing large labor forces, coordinating the construction of monumental architecture, managing agricultural production and distribution, and maintaining the religious and ceremonial practices that legitimized their authority. The archaeological record provides glimpses of this organization. The careful planning evident in the layout of the city, the standardization of pottery and architectural elements, the evidence of long-distance trade networks. Yet this organization was not static or inevitable. It required constant maintenance, continuous investment of resources, and careful negotiation of competing interests and claims. The elite of Tiwanaku maintained their position through a combination of religious authority, control of valuable resources, the organization of labor for monumental construction, and the sponsorship of ritual feasting. These feasts, where large quantities of food and drink were distributed to assembled crowds, served multiple purposes simultaneously. They demonstrated the generosity and power of the sponsoring elite, reinforced social bonds and hierarchies, and created religious experiences that confirmed the spiritual authority of those who controlled the ritual. This was the Tiwanaku of the 600 to 800 era, a city of stone and water, of monumental architecture and sophisticated agriculture, of religious authority and long-distance influence. It was a civilization that had learned not merely to survive in one of the world's most challenging environments, but to flourish, to create beauty, and to project power across vast distances. The people who lived in this city and the vast agricultural hinterland that sustained it had achieved something remarkable: a stable, prosperous civilization, sustained by human ingenuity and careful adaptation to environmental constraints. Yet even at the height of its power, the seeds of Tiwanaku's eventual transformation were already present. The very systems that had enabled its rise, the dependence on carefully managed agriculture, the reliance on trade networks, the concentration of power in the hands of an elite whose authority rested on religious claims and resource control, contained within them the potential for crisis. The climate of the Altiplano, while generally stable over long periods, was subject to variation. Droughts lasting years or even decades were possible. The trade networks that brought exotic goods and ideas to Tiwanaku were themselves vulnerable to disruption. and the political structures that maintained elite authority, while effective during periods of prosperity, could become brittle and unstable during times of stress. For now, though, in the glory days of the 600 to 800 era, such concerns seemed distant. Tiwanaku stood at the apex of its power, a city of monuments and mysteries, a civilization that had transformed the high Andes into a landscape of human achievement and spiritual significance. The raised fields stretched across the plain, producing the surplus that fed the urban population. The temples stood tall against the thin mountain air. The elite gathered in ceremonial spaces to perform the rituals that sustained cosmic order. Trade goods arrived from distant lands. Pilgrims traveled to sacred sites to commune with the divine. Tiwanaku was not merely a city. It was a complete world, a self-contained universe of meaning and power. But nothing in history remains static. The very success of Tiwanaku's adaptation to the Altiplano's challenges would eventually contribute to vulnerabilities that even the civilization's considerable ingenuity could not overcome. The story of Tiwanaku's rise is therefore also the story of the conditions that would eventually lead to its transformation and decline. In understanding the mechanisms that enabled Tiwanaku's flourishing, we begin to perceive the fragilities that would ultimately reshape this remarkable civilization. The height of Tiwanaku's influence arrived not as a sudden rupture, but as a crescendo. A civilization reaching its fullest expression around 600 to 800 of the Common Era. By this time, the city that had gradually emerged from the harsh Altiplano had become something extraordinary. A place where human ambition had taken physical form in stone, where engineering had overcome the limitations of geography, and where the spiritual and material worlds seemed to merge in ceremonial spaces designed to communicate with the divine. To understand Tiwanaku at its apex is to understand a society that had moved beyond mere survival. The raised fields that had transformed the landscape into productive gardens now supported a population dense enough to sustain a sophisticated urban center. Thousands of people moved through a carefully organized city, each district serving its function, each structure contributing to a larger architectural vision. The core ceremonial area stretched across roughly 6 square kilometers, a vast expanse of ritual significance that would have appeared almost otherworldly to travelers approaching from the surrounding highlands. The city's grandeur was not accidental. It was the deliberate expression of a worldview, a cosmology rendered in stone and earth. The Kalasasaya temple complex stood as testimony to this ambition. This rectangular enclosure, built from precisely fitted ashlar blocks, created a space that functioned simultaneously as gathering place, ritual stage, and astronomical observatory. Within its walls, the famous Gateway of the Sun rose as a masterpiece of monolithic carving, a single block of andesite stone, weighing approximately 9 tons, intricately carved with geometric patterns and the image of a principal deity. This gateway was not merely decorative. It served as a threshold between the mundane and sacred, a physical manifestation of Tiwanaku's understanding of cosmic order. The precision of Tiwanaku's stonework remains remarkable to modern observers. Blocks were fitted so carefully that a knife blade cannot pass between them. This was not the work of a society with crude tools or uncertain ambitions. Rather, it represents the culmination of centuries of accumulated knowledge about stone cutting, measurement, and structural engineering. The stones themselves were quarried from sources kilometers away, transported across difficult terrain, and positioned with such accuracy that the structures have survived earthquakes and centuries of abandonment with relatively minimal damage. The Akapana pyramid dominated the cityscape, a massive artificial hill that rose approximately 18 meters into the thin mountain air. This was no simple burial mound. It was a sophisticated piece of hydraulic engineering. Channels carved into the pyramid's surface directed water, creating a system that collected rainfall and channeled it for storage or ritual use. At its summit, elite ceremonies took place. From this elevated vantage point, the city spread below like a mandala, each sector arranged according to principles that modern archaeologists continue to decode. The pyramid itself was constructed in a cross shape when viewed from above, further emphasizing the cosmological significance of the site. Yet the true genius of Tiwanaku lay not in its monumental architecture alone, but in the integration of that architecture with an agricultural system of breathtaking sophistication. The raised fields surrounding the city represented an engineering solution to environmental challenges that would have defeated less innovative societies. These fields, known locally as waru-waru, were elevated planting platforms separated by canals. During the day, the water in these canals absorbed heat from the sun. At night, this stored heat prevented frost from destroying crops, a crucial advantage in a region where freezing temperatures could devastate harvests even in the growing season. The raised fields were not haphazardly arranged. They followed a carefully planned geometry, often organized in parallel lines that stretched across the landscape for kilometers. The canals between them served multiple functions. They provided water for irrigation during dry periods. They created microclimates that protected crops, and they supported fish and aquatic plants that supplemented the diet. Archaeological investigation has revealed that these systems, when reconstructed by modern researchers, produce yields comparable to or exceeding those of conventional agriculture in the same region. This was not primitive farming. This was an integrated system of resource management that extracted maximum productivity from a challenging environment. The scale of this agricultural infrastructure was staggering. Scholars estimate that at its peak, the system of raised fields surrounding Tiwanaku covered thousands of hectares. The labor required to construct and maintain these fields would have been enormous, indicating a society capable of coordinating large-scale projects and compelling or motivating the population to undertake them. This capacity for collective action, organized at such a scale, speaks to a sophisticated political structure and a belief system powerful enough to unite diverse groups around shared goals. The influence of Tiwanaku extended far beyond its immediate hinterland. Trade networks connected the city to regions hundreds of kilometers distant. Archaeological evidence reveals that goods from the coast of what is now Peru reached Tiwanaku, while Tiwanaku-style pottery and religious iconography appear in sites across the Altiplano and into the Yungas, the cloud forest regions to the east. This was not military conquest in the traditional sense, though scholars continue to debate the exact nature of Tiwanaku's political reach. Some researchers argue for a loose confederation of communities united by shared religious beliefs and ritual practices. Others suggest a more centralized state with administrative control over distant territories. The evidence supports some form of expansive influence, though the mechanisms by which Tiwanaku maintained its authority over such vast distances remain incompletely understood. The religious system that bound this empire together was complex and sophisticated. The principal deity, depicted on the gateway of the sun, was associated with fertility, agriculture, and cosmic order. This figure holds ceremonial vessels in each hand, suggesting a role in the redistribution of resources and the maintenance of social relationships. Around this central deity, other figures and symbols radiate, creating a cosmological diagram rendered in stone. The gateway itself may have served as a kind of visual scripture, communicating theological concepts to those who viewed it. Ritual feasting appears to have played a central role in maintaining Tiwanaku's social cohesion. Archaeologists have identified large quantities of ceramic vessels used for serving food and drink in ceremonial contexts. These feasts would have brought together people from different regions and social classes, reaffirming their connection to Tiwanaku and to each other. The consumption of food and drink prepared and distributed by elite authorities created bonds of reciprocal obligation that held the society together more effectively than coercion alone could have achieved. The physical city itself reflected this hierarchical structure. Elite residences occupied certain sectors, distinguished by more elaborate construction and proximity to ceremonial spaces. Artisans' quarters have been identified where specialized craftspeople produced the fine ceramics, stone tools, and other goods that Tiwanaku was known for. Residential areas for common people extended outward, becoming less densely settled at the city's periphery. This spatial organization was not random. It reflected and reinforced the social order. Movement through the city was a journey through layers of authority and spiritual significance, with each zone communicating its own message about the society's values and structures. By around 800 of the Common Era, Tiwanaku had reached an architectural and cultural zenith. The major monuments were complete or nearing completion. The city's population had grown to perhaps 40,000 people or more, making it one of the largest urban centers in the pre-Columbian Americas. The raised field system was functioning at full capacity. Trade networks were established and flourishing. The religious system was elaborately developed. To all appearances, Tiwanaku had solved the fundamental problems of existence in the high Andes. It had created a stable, productive, hierarchically organized society that could support specialized craftspeople, religious specialists, and an elite class. It had built monuments that would endure for centuries after its abandonment. Yet within this period of maximum power, the seeds of future challenges were already germinating. Climate records preserved in ice cores and lake sediments reveal that the period from 600 to 800 CE, while generally stable, contained within it the potential for disruption. Rainfall patterns, while adequate, were not uniform. There were periods of relative plenty and periods of stress. The system of raised fields, for all its sophistication, was dependent on careful maintenance. The canals required regular cleaning and repair. The soil needed to be managed to prevent degradation. This was a system that worked brilliantly when everything functioned as intended, but it was also a system that could fail catastrophically if key elements broke down. The monumental architecture that represented Tiwanaku's greatest achievement also represented a significant investment of resources. The labor required to quarry, transport, and position the massive stones of the Kalasasaya and other structures could have been directed toward agricultural production or other activities. This was not necessarily wasteful. The monuments served crucial functions in maintaining social cohesion and communicating the authority of the state. But it did represent a significant commitment of resources to non-productive activities. A society that maintained such a commitment would need to be confident in its ability to meet its basic needs through the remaining resources available to it. Scholars continue to debate the extent of Tiwanaku's political control. A significant competing power existed to the north, in the region around Huari, in what is now Peru. This civilization, contemporary with Tiwanaku at its height, developed its own distinctive architectural style and expanded its influence across a wide area. The relationship between Tiwanaku and Huari remains unclear. They may have existed in peaceful coexistence, trading partners exchanging goods across the Altiplano. They may have competed for resources and influence. They may have influenced each other culturally. with ideas and artistic styles flowing between them. The evidence is ambiguous, and scholars who have devoted careers to studying this period still debate the nature of the interaction. What is clear is that by 800 of the Common Era, the world in which Tiwanaku had risen was beginning to shift. The stable patterns that had characterized the first centuries of Tiwanaku's development were becoming less predictable. The climate of the Andes, influenced by larger global patterns, was entering a phase of greater variability. The agricultural systems that had been refined over centuries were now supporting a population that had grown to depend on their consistent productivity. The political structure that maintained Tiwanaku's authority over distant communities was functioning, but it required constant reinforcement through ritual, trade, and the distribution of goods and prestige items. The discovery in 2023 of a previously unknown temple complex, roughly 130 miles south of the main site, has expanded scholars' understanding of Tiwanaku's ritual landscape. This temple, identified by researchers including Jose Capriles of Penn State University, sits on a hilltop in the Andes and appears to have served as a pilgrimage destination or secondary ceremonial center. Its discovery, published in the journal Antiquity, suggests that Tiwanaku's religious influence extended across a wider territory than previously recognized, and that the civilization maintained a network of ritual sites that connected distant communities to the religious and political center. At this moment of maximum expansion and power, Tiwanaku stood at a threshold. The systems it had developed were functioning magnificently. The monuments it built expressed a vision of cosmic order and human achievement. The population it supported lived in relative security and prosperity. The influence it exerted shaped religious beliefs and cultural practices across the Altiplano. Yet the very success of Tiwanaku, the concentration of population in the city, the dependence on specialized agricultural systems, the commitment of resources to monumental construction, had created a society that was, in some ways, fragile. It was stable as long as the conditions that had produced its success remained constant. But the Altiplano was entering a period when those conditions would begin to shift, when the climate would become less predictable, when the social cohesion that held the empire together would face new challenges, and when the careful balance that Tiwanaku had achieved would become increasingly difficult to maintain. This was the civilization at its height, powerful, confident, architecturally magnificent, religiously sophisticated, and economically productive. Yet it was also a civilization that had committed itself to a particular vision of how human society should be organized and how resources should be allocated. That commitment would, in the centuries to come, make it vulnerable to precisely the kinds of changes that the climate of the Andes was preparing to deliver. The zenith of Tiwanaku's power, that remarkable moment when the civilization reached its fullest expression, contained within it the seeds of its own transformation. Between 600 and 800 CE, when the great monuments rose and the trade networks flourished across the Andes, the very systems that had enabled Tiwanaku's ascendancy began to reveal their fragility. This is not a story of sudden catastrophe or dramatic collapse, but rather the slow unraveling of a civilization caught between the demands of its own ambitions and the indifferent forces of nature and social complexity. To understand this turning point, we must first recognize what Tiwanaku had become by the height of its influence. The city that had grown from humble agricultural settlements on the Bolivian Altiplano had transformed into a sprawling urban center covering over 400 hectares at its peak, with a ceremonial core spanning approximately 6 square kilometers. The raised fields stretched across the landscape in geometric precision. The monumental architecture dominated the skyline, and the trade routes extended far beyond the Titicaca Basin. Tiwanaku had achieved something extraordinary. A civilization that had mastered one of Earth's most inhospitable environments and created a complex society capable of coordinating massive construction projects, maintaining long-distance trade relationships, and sustaining a population that scholars estimate may have reached tens of thousands. Yet this success came with invisible costs. The archaeological evidence reveals that even as Tiwanaku reached its peak, the environmental pressures that had shaped the region were intensifying. The climate of the Bolivian Altiplano is inherently variable and unforgiving. Droughts occur with irregular frequency, and the thin soils at 12,000 feet above sea level offer little margin for error. The raised field agricultural system, for all its ingenuity, depended on a delicate balance of water management, soil composition, and seasonal precipitation. Recent research by scholars studying paleoclimate data has identified what appears to be a significant period of climatic instability beginning around 800 CE, precisely as Tiwanaku reached its territorial and architectural apex. The climate change was not dramatic in the way we might imagine catastrophe. There were no sudden earthquakes that toppled the temples, no volcanic eruptions that buried the city. Instead, what occurred was a gradual alteration in precipitation patterns. The evidence preserved in lake sediments and ice cores suggests that the region experienced increasingly erratic rainfall, with more frequent droughts interspersed with periods of heavy precipitation. For a civilization whose entire agricultural system was calibrated to manage the region's water with precision, this mounting variability became a mounting crisis. The raised fields, those ingenious platforms that had enabled Tiwanaku to feed its growing population, began to show signs of strain. The canals that ran between the fields required constant maintenance. The earthen platforms themselves needed periodic reconstruction to prevent erosion. In times of abundant rainfall and stable climate, this system could support significant population growth. But as the climate grew more erratic, the margin between success and failure narrowed dramatically. A single severe drought could devastate the harvest. Consecutive poor years could create famine conditions. What makes this environmental crisis particularly significant is that it arrived at a moment when Tiwanaku's social and political systems were themselves becoming increasingly complex and potentially rigid. The civilization had developed a hierarchical structure centered on elite classes who derived their authority partly through their control of resources and their ability to organize massive construction projects. The great monuments, the Akapana pyramid, the Kalasasaya temple complex with its gateway of the sun, the semi-subterranean court, were not merely architectural achievements. They were statements of power, visible demonstrations of the elite's ability to command labor and resources on an unprecedented scale. This system of elite authority had functioned well during times of plenty. When the raised fields produced abundant harvests, when trade brought exotic goods from distant regions, when construction projects could be completed and celebrated, the authority of the ruling classes appeared natural and justified. The ritual system that centered on these monuments and on the ceremonial use of elite objects, the monolithic statues holding keros, the intricate carvings depicting sacred beings, reinforced the social order. But this elaborate system of authority depended fundamentally on the elite's ability to deliver material prosperity and maintain the appearance of cosmic order. As environmental pressures mounted, this social contract began to show cracks. The archaeological record suggests that around 1000 CE, some 800 years after Tiwanaku had first risen to prominence in the Titicaca Basin, the city began to experience significant stress. The evidence is subtle, but compelling. Construction projects that had characterized the peak period appear to have ceased or slowed considerably. Some residential areas show signs of abandonment. The distribution of elite goods becomes less uniform, suggesting that the tight control of prestige items may have been loosening. Scholars debate the precise mechanisms of decline. Some emphasize environmental determinism, arguing that the climate change was simply too severe for the agricultural system to sustain, leading to resource depletion and eventual starvation. Others point to evidence of internal fragmentation, suggesting that as resources became scarcer, rival factions within the elite class began to compete for control, leading to political instability. Still others propose that the very success of Tiwanaku's trade networks may have contributed to its vulnerability. If the city had become dependent on importing certain goods or resources from distant regions, disruptions to those trade relationships, perhaps caused by changes affecting other civilizations or regions, could have had cascading effects on Tiwanaku's economy. The truth, as is often the case with historical complexity, likely involves multiple factors operating simultaneously. The climate did become more erratic. The agricultural system did face increasing pressure. The elite's authority did begin to erode as their ability to guarantee prosperity declined. And the broader geopolitical landscape of the Andes was shifting in ways that may have affected Tiwanaku's position. Contemporaneous with Tiwanaku's decline was the presence of another major civilization in the Andes, the Wari culture, which flourished in the southern highlands of what is now Peru. The relationship between Tiwanaku and Wari remains one of the great puzzles of Andean archaeology. Were they rivals competing for dominance? Did they trade peacefully? Was there conflict between them? The archaeological evidence remains tantalizingly unclear. What we do know is that Wari was expanding and consolidating its own regional power during the same period when Tiwanaku began to experience difficulties. Whether this was coincidence or cause remains debated among scholars. The physical evidence of Tiwanaku's crisis comes to us through the careful excavations of archaeologists who have worked at the site over decades. The systematic investigations led by scholars such as Carlos Ponce Sanginés in the mid-20th century, followed by Alan Colada's work in the 1980s and 90s, and continuing through more recent research by José Capriles and Bolivian teams, have gradually revealed the story written in stone and soil. One particularly significant discovery came in 2023, when researchers identified a previously unknown temple complex roughly 130 miles south of the main Tiwanaku site, situated on a hilltop in the Andes. This discovery, published in the journal Antiquity, revealed that Tiwanaku's influence and ritual network extended far beyond what had previously been documented. But it also raised intriguing questions about the nature of that network. As the central authority weakened, what happened to these outlying ritual centers? Did they continue to function independently? Did they maintain ties to the central city? Or did they become disconnected, losing their connection to the broader Tiwanaku system? The crisis was not uniformly experienced across the civilization's territory. In some areas, the transition from Tiwanaku dominance to whatever came after appears to have been relatively gradual. In others, there is evidence of more abrupt change. The raised field system, that marvel of agricultural engineering, began to fall into disrepair. Without the coordinated labor and central organization that Tiwanaku had provided, the maintenance of these complex systems became impossible. The canals filled with silt, the platforms eroded. Within a few generations, the landscape that had been so carefully engineered began to revert to a more natural state. The human dimension of this crisis can only be partially reconstructed from the archaeological evidence. We know from skeletal remains and other biological evidence that the population experienced stress during this period. malnutrition markers appear more frequently in human remains dating to the later centuries of Tiwanaku's occupation. This suggests that food security was becoming a real concern for at least portions of the population. Whether the elite experienced these deprivations as severely as the general population remains unclear, but the pattern suggests that the prosperity which had characterized the peak period was increasingly unequally distributed. The elite response to this crisis is written in the material culture of the period. Rather than abandoning their ceremonial practices or their monumental architecture, the ruling classes appear to have doubled down on ritual and symbolic display. New statues were carved. Ceremonies continued to be performed. The Gateway of the Sun, that remarkable andesite portal decorated with intricate carvings of sacred iconography, may have been completed or reconfigured during this very period of stress. It is as if the elite, sensing their authority slipping away, attempted to reinforce it through intensified ritual and monumental display. But this strategy, understandable as it was, could not address the fundamental problem. You cannot cure famine with ceremonies, no matter how elaborate. You cannot restore ecological stability through ritual. The environmental pressures continued to mount, and the social fabric of Tiwanaku began to fray. The collapse of Tiwanaku was not a sudden event. Rather, it was a prolonged process of decline that unfolded over several centuries. By 1000 CE, roughly 200 years after the onset of the crisis, the great city had largely ceased to function as a unified urban center. By 1100 CE, Tiwanaku had been substantially abandoned. The monuments stood, but the vibrant civilization that had built them was no longer there. What is remarkable about this decline is not that it occurred. Civilizations rise and fall throughout history, but rather how it occurred. Tiwanaku did not disappear entirely. Its influence persisted in complex ways. The people who had lived there did not vanish. They dispersed, migrated, adapted. Some moved to lower elevations where environmental pressures were less severe. Some joined neighboring groups. Some maintained themselves in the Titicaca Basin region, gradually transforming their relationship to the landscape and to each other. The crisis of Tiwanaku, then, is not a story of simple collapse, but rather a story of transformation. A civilization that had achieved remarkable things found itself unable to sustain those achievements in the face of environmental stress and social complexity. The very systems that had enabled its rise, the hierarchical organization, the centralized control of resources, the dependence on a finely tuned agricultural system, became liabilities when conditions changed. This turning point, this moment when the trajectory of Tiwanaku shifted from ascendancy to decline, reveals something profound about the nature of human civilization. We tend to imagine that great achievements, once made, are permanent. But civilizations are not monuments carved in stone. They are living systems, dependent on continuous inputs of energy, resources, and social cooperation. When those inputs are disrupted, when environmental or social conditions change, the entire system must adapt or fail. Tiwanaku's crisis was the moment when adaptation became impossible, when the old ways could no longer sustain the society that had built them. It was a turning point not only in the history of one civilization, but in the history of the Andes themselves. What would emerge from Tiwanaku's decline would be new forms of organization, new responses to the challenges of living in one of Earth's most demanding environments. The story of the Andes would continue, but it would be a different story, written by people who had learned, through Tiwanaku's example, both the possibilities and the limits of human adaptation to extreme environments. The story of Tiwanaku does not end in the mountains where it began. Around 1,000 years before the present day, as the civilization that had flourished for nearly 4 centuries began to fragment and fade, something remarkable occurred. Rather than vanishing entirely into the mists of pre-Columbian history, Tiwanaku's influence transformed. It became something less visible, but no less profound, a spiritual and cultural inheritance that would reshape the Andean world for centuries to come. By approximately 1000 CE, the great city near Lake Titicaca had entered its final phase. The massive temple complexes that had dominated the landscape for generations stood increasingly silent. The raised fields that had sustained thousands began to fall into disrepair. Archaeological evidence suggests that the collapse occurred gradually rather than suddenly, a slow unwinding rather than a dramatic rupture. Scholars debate the precise causes, with some emphasizing environmental stress and others pointing to political fragmentation and the loss of elite legitimacy that had once held the civilization together through ritual, feasting, and monumental construction. What seems clear is that by 1100 CE, the city was largely abandoned. The stones remained, weathered and silent, but the people who had built them had dispersed into the surrounding highlands. Yet this apparent ending contained within it a profound beginning. The knowledge systems that Tiwanaku had developed, the agricultural innovations that had sustained its population, and the spiritual and artistic traditions that had given it meaning, did not simply vanish. Instead, these achievements lived on, absorbed and transformed by the successor cultures that would rise across the Andean region. Most significantly, the cultural heritage of Tiwanaku would profoundly influence the Inca Empire, which would eventually dominate much of South America and create one of the world's most remarkable civilizations. The connection between Tiwanaku and the Inca is not one of direct political succession, but rather of cultural and spiritual inheritance. The Inca, who would emerge as a significant power only in the 1400s CE, long after Tiwanaku's collapse, inherited a landscape already transformed by their predecessors. They encountered ruins of unprecedented sophistication. They discovered raised field systems that demonstrated advanced understanding of high-altitude agriculture. They found architectural principles embedded in stone, the precise masonry, the understanding of seismic engineering, the integration of ceremonial spaces into urban planning. Most importantly, they inherited a conceptual framework for how a complex civilization could be organized and sustained in the challenging Andean environment. The Inca people would adopt and adapt many of Tiwanaku's fundamental innovations. The raised field agricultural system, which Tiwanaku had perfected over centuries, became a model that Inca administrators would implement across their expanding empire. The architectural principles evident in Tiwanaku's monumental structures, the precise stone fitting, the careful attention to drainage and structural integrity, would appear again in Inca buildings throughout the Andes. The Inca would even incorporate Tiwanaku's religious iconography into their own spiritual systems. The Gateway of the Sun, that extraordinary andesite portal carved with the image of the principal deity, would become an object of pilgrimage and reverence for Inca rulers, who understood its significance as a link to an earlier golden age. This process of cultural transmission operated on multiple levels. At the most visible level, there was deliberate emulation. Inca rulers, seeking to establish the legitimacy and antiquity of their dynasty, would consciously model themselves on the achievements they found in Tiwanaku's ruins. They would claim spiritual descent from Tiwanaku's greatness. They would incorporate Tiwanaku's aesthetic principles into their own artistic production. At a deeper level, however, the inheritance was more fundamental. Local populations living in the regions that Tiwanaku had once dominated carried forward practical knowledge about agriculture, water management, and construction techniques. This embodied knowledge, passed down through generations of farmers and builders, represented a continuity of understanding that transcended the political collapse of the civilization itself. The spiritual legacy of Tiwanaku proved equally enduring. The ceremonial traditions that had animated Tiwanaku's religious life, the ritual offerings, the feasting ceremonies, the pilgrimage practices, would echo through Andean culture for centuries. The Island of the Sun, located in Lake Titicaca and long associated with Tiwanaku's ritual practices, remained a place of profound spiritual significance. Archaeological studies have revealed gold medallions and carved stones deposited in the lake's waters near this island, evidence of ritual offerings that continued long after Tiwanaku's political decline. These practices suggest that the sacred landscape Tiwanaku had created retained its power even as the civilization that had shaped it disappeared. The transformation of Tiwanaku's legacy represents a crucial insight into how civilizations actually influence history. We often think of cultural transmission in terms of conquest and succession, as though one empire simply replaces another. The reality is more subtle and more enduring. Tiwanaku did not need to persist as a political entity to shape the future. Its achievements had already been woven into the fabric of Andean life. Its innovations had proven their worth through centuries of practical application. Its spiritual insights had resonated deeply enough to transcend any single dynasty or political system. In recent decades, archaeological work has revealed the deeper extent of Tiwanaku's influence across the Andean region. The discovery in 2023 of a previously unknown temple complex located approximately 130 miles south of the main Tiwanaku site, on a hilltop in the Andes, published in the journal Antiquity, and led by researcher Jose Capriles of Penn State University, has fundamentally expanded our understanding of Tiwanaku's reach. This temple, situated at coordinates roughly 16.56 degrees south and 68.67 degrees west, demonstrates that Tiwanaku's ritual and political network extended far beyond what scholars had previously recognized. The existence of such satellite complexes suggests that Tiwanaku maintained influence through a system of ritual centers and pilgrimage sites that bound together distant communities into a shared spiritual and cultural framework. This discovery has profound implications for understanding how Tiwanaku actually functioned and how its influence persisted. Rather than a centralized empire exerting direct political control, Tiwanaku appears to have operated as a spiritual and cultural hub, drawing people from across the region to participate in shared ceremonies, trade networks, and artistic traditions. When the central authority fragmented and the city was abandoned, these networks did not simply disappear. Instead, they transformed. The ritual sites remained. The artistic traditions continued. The agricultural knowledge persisted. What vanished was the political structure that had coordinated them, but the underlying cultural coherence lived on. The environmental challenges that contributed to Tiwanaku's collapse also shaped its long-term legacy. The same climate variations and environmental stresses that had forced Tiwanaku to develop sophisticated agricultural solutions would continue to affect the Andean region. The raised field systems that Tiwanaku had created represented solutions to these persistent challenges. As later civilizations, including the Inca, faced similar environmental pressures, they found in Tiwanaku's innovations a proven blueprint for sustainability. This practical inheritance may have been as important as any spiritual or cultural transmission. It represented knowledge that had been tested against the harsh realities of high-altitude agriculture and had proven its worth. The monumental architecture of Tiwanaku, the Akapana pyramid, the Kalasasaya temple complex, the semi-subterranean court, and the other structures that had dominated the landscape, also served as a kind of permanent archive of knowledge and achievement. These buildings were not merely symbolic expressions of power. They embodied practical knowledge about construction, engineering, and spatial organization. The precise stone-fitting techniques that Tiwanaku builders had mastered were preserved in the structures themselves, available for later peoples to study and emulate. The drainage systems built into Tiwanaku's architecture, the understanding of how to construct stable buildings in a seismically active region, the principles of urban planning evident in the site's layout, all of these remained visible and comprehensible long after the civilization that had created them had ceased to exist. The question of Tiwanaku's relationship with other contemporary cultures, particularly the Wari Empire, adds another dimension to understanding its legacy. Scholars continue to debate the extent and nature of interaction between Tiwanaku and Wari, two major civilizations that flourished during overlapping periods in the pre-Columbian Andes. Some evidence suggests peaceful coexistence and cultural exchange. Other interpretations propose competition or even conflict. What seems clear is that both civilizations developed sophisticated responses to the challenges of Andean life and that both influenced the cultures that would follow. The legacy of Tiwanaku, however, appears to have been particularly strong in the southern highlands and around Lake Titicaca, where its ruins remained as tangible reminders of a glorious past. The process by which Tiwanaku's achievements were preserved and transmitted involved multiple mechanisms operating simultaneously. Oral traditions carried forward stories of the civilization's greatness, ensuring that later generations understood themselves as inheritors of a magnificent heritage. The physical remains of Tiwanaku's architecture served as monuments to these traditions, standing as proof of the civilization's achievements and as sources of ongoing inspiration for architects and engineers. The practical knowledge embedded in Tiwanaku's agricultural systems, its water management techniques, and its construction methods was preserved through practice and apprenticeship, passed down through generations of farmers and builders who understood these techniques not as ancient curiosities, but as living solutions to contemporary challenges. Religious and spiritual traditions also played a crucial role in maintaining Tiwanaku's legacy. The sacred landscape that Tiwanaku had created, the temple complexes, the pilgrimage sites, the ritual centers, retained spiritual significance even as the political structure that had organized them collapsed. Pilgrims continued to visit these sacred places. Ceremonies continued to be performed. The spiritual insights that Tiwanaku's religious specialists had developed continued to resonate with people seeking to understand their relationship to the divine and to the natural world. When the Inca emerged as a dominant power centuries later, they would deliberately engage with this spiritual heritage, visiting Tiwanaku's ruins and incorporating them into their own religious worldview. The collapse of Tiwanaku also demonstrates important principles about how complex civilizations respond to environmental stress and how they ultimately influence history even after their political decline. The scholars who have studied Tiwanaku's collapse, researchers like Alan Colata of the University of Chicago, who conducted extensive research in the 1980s and 1990s on raised field agriculture and urban organization, and more recent researchers like Jose Capriles, who continue to uncover new evidence about Tiwanaku's reach, have emphasized that civilizations do not persist or disappear in isolation. They exist within networks of cultural exchange, environmental constraint, and social relationship. When Tiwanaku declined, these networks did not simply cease. They were reorganized. They were transformed. They continued to shape the development of Andean societies. The study of Tiwanaku's legacy also illuminates how we understand the concept of civilization itself. We often speak of civilizations rising and falling as though they were discrete entities with clear birth and death dates. Yet the reality is more complex. Civilizations are manifestations of human knowledge, creativity, and social organization. These things do not disappear simply because a particular political structure collapses. They are inherited, adapted, and transformed by successor cultures. Tiwanaku's collapse around 1000 CE did not represent the end of Andean civilization. Rather, it represented a transition. The knowledge, skills, spiritual insights, and cultural achievements that Tiwanaku had accumulated over centuries of development did not vanish. Instead, they became part of the foundation upon which later civilizations would build. In the present day, as scholars continue to excavate, analyze, and interpret the remains of Tiwanaku, the civilization continues to yield new insights into its nature and influence. The ongoing work of Bolivian teams and international collaborators adds to our understanding with each new discovery. The identification of previously unknown temple complexes, the analysis of raised field systems using modern archaeological techniques, the study of ritual practices through the examination of artifacts recovered from Lake Titicaca, all of these contribute to a more complete picture of how Tiwanaku functioned and how it influenced the societies that followed. Tiwanaku stands today as one of the great mysteries of human civilization, not because its disappearance is incomprehensible, but because its achievement and influence are so profound. A civilization that flourished high in the Andes Mountains, that developed sophisticated agricultural systems to sustain thousands in a harsh environment, that created monumental architecture and complex spiritual traditions, that maintained extensive trade networks and cultural influence across a vast region. Such a civilization leaves marks that persist long after its political structure has dissolved. The ruins that remain at Tiwanaku, the knowledge systems that continued to be practiced in the surrounding regions, the spiritual traditions that were preserved and transformed by successor cultures, the architectural principles that influenced later builders. These represent the true legacy of Tiwanaku. The story of Tiwanaku is ultimately a story about the resilience of human knowledge and the persistence of cultural achievement. It is a reminder that civilizations influence history not only through their duration, but through the depth and quality of what they accomplish. Tiwanaku may have declined and been largely abandoned by 1100 CE, but its influence extended forward through centuries and helped shape one of the world's greatest civilizations. The Inca, when they rose to power in the 1400s CE, built upon foundations that Tiwanaku had laid. They inherited a landscape already transformed by sophisticated agricultural innovation. They possessed architectural principles that could be studied in the ruins of Tiwanaku's buildings. They drew spiritual inspiration from the sacred sites that Tiwanaku had established. In these ways, Tiwanaku did not truly end. It transformed. It became part of something larger and eventually helped create an empire that would dominate much of South America. The mystery that surrounds Tiwanaku, then, is not the mystery of a civilization that vanished without trace. It is the mystery of how human societies adapt and persist, how knowledge is preserved and transmitted, how the achievements of one generation become the foundation for the end standing among the ruins of Tiwanaku today. One encounters not an ending, but a transformation. The stones remain. The knowledge embedded in them persists. The spiritual significance of the landscape continues to resonate, and the influence of this remarkable civilization continues to echo through history, reminding us that the greatest achievements of human civilization are not those that last forever unchanged, but those that prove flexible enough to be adapted and transformed by generations yet to come.
Thank you.